Welcome to the Greater Phoenix Economic Council's CHIPS Act webinar. This is an ongoing series of CHIPS Act webinars to help you and your organization leverage this federal program. As part of the CHIPS and Science Act, the Department of Commerce is overseeing $50 billion to revitalize the US semiconductor industry, including $39 billion in semiconductor incentives. Since the first notification release on the 28th of February, the Department of Commerce has continued to regularly release more updates, including the pre-application and application instructions, guidebooks, and other resources for the first CHIPS for America funding opportunity for leading edge, current generation, mature node, and back-end semiconductor fabrication facilities. In addition, the department has posted on chips.gov the pre-application materials for all applicants and full application materials for applicants seeking incentives for leading edge facilities. Today's webcast will cover the recent guidelines, updates, and pre-application. Thank you again to our viewers for taking time to join us today. My name is Sean Fogarty, and I'm the Vice President of International Business Development for the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. Just a little housekeeping. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. Audience members are muted and without video. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared at a later date. Due to time constraints, we will not be accepting live questions from viewers. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please try logging out, checking your connection, and logging back in. I need to highlight our disclaimer. The information provided on the webinar does not constitute legal advice. Instead, all information, content, and materials available on this webinar and website are for general informational purposes only. Viewers of this webinar should contact their attorney or qualified service providers to obtain advice with respect to CHIPS Act funding and application. Feel free to contact GPEC and we'll be happy to make connections with qualified professionals. The views expressed are those of the individual speakers in their individual capacities only. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this webinar are hereby expressly disclaimed. The content is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. Lastly, I want to encourage you to sign up on the GPEC CHIPS Act resource page to receive updates. Our presenters today are Michael Patterson, Patrick Lawhon, Brett Johnson, and Troy Galan. So our first speaker is Mike Patterson, a partner with Spencer Fane, a firm of 425 attorneys in 22 US cities. He helps businesses navigate corporate, compliance, securities, and transactional matters. He has extensive experience in domestic and international mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, distribution, licensing matters, and market entry strategies. He has recently been working with his team to help multiple companies in the semiconductor industry and supply chain, whether on CHIPS compliance, leasing, construction, corporate structuring, technology licensing, workforce, employment, and other issues. Joining Mike is Patrick Lawhon. Patrick is an associate at Spencer Fane. He works on a range of transactional matters, including mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, private securities offerings, and formation and structure of business entities for clients ranging from early stage startups to more mature companies. So with that, I will hand over to Mike, who will begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sean. Let's go to the first slide there on steps. We did a presentation back on March 13th going over in detail the statement of interest. Everyone on this call who intends ultimately to do an application under the CHIPS Act, the door has been opened for you to file and upload a statement of interest, which is a short description of your project according to a list of questions that the department has about submitting, giving the department the ability to gauge your interest in CHIPS funding, find out where you fit, and determine when you're going to apply again, whether you're in this first notice of funding opportunity, NOFO, or whether you'll be in the second one where it's equipment or other supply chain people, or in the third one, research and development maybe. But they're trying to figure out and gauge interest and be ready on their side, and see, what's out there as well. If people interested in applying for CHIPS must also register with the government's System for Award Management, sam.gov. And even though normally you can get a number and registered in a couple of days, it can sometimes take much longer. So don't delay on that point. We have a memo we can get to you where you can work up your statement of interest offline and then upload it when you're ready for it and have had some advice. I would encourage you to get some advice on that. The pre-application, which is the focus for today's presentation, was the subject of the government's recent download of many materials and a lengthy presentation they gave. It's a more detailed description of the project, as well as financial information and information about how you're going to work your project, environmental impact, workforce plan, etc. Some of those parts are optional, but strongly encouraged. It is optional to do a pre-application, but it's strongly encouraged by the department. Then they will give you a response and offer comments that can be incorporated in your full application. You cannot, if you do a pre-app, which we're going to talk about today, you cannot do your full app until you've responded to all the great information that they gave you, the feedback in your pre-app process. Then they'll engage in a dialogue with you to get other information and clarifications. The preliminary, next slide, preliminary memorandum of terms is if you have a promising project, the department will offer a non-binding preliminary memorandum of terms if it seems like you're likely to reach final approval. Next slide. Then they will engage in some due diligence with you, back and forth with you and the department, and even an environmental review during that process. And finally, there will be an award preparation and issuance, and they'll send along legal documents back and forth with you to provide the award itself. Money will come in tranches tied to certain milestones determined based upon the details of the project. Some key dates on the next slide. Some key dates as of February 28th, which is past. Everyone on this call, anybody wanting to, that thinks they're going to participate in this process, whether through this notice of funding opportunity or a later one, can go ahead and submit their statement of interest, even if they're not one of the leading edgers right now, if they're a supply chain or a materials or a research and development. As of March 31, pre-application and full applications, the door was open for leading edge projects only, leading edge manufacturers. As of May 1st, pre-applications could be submitted for current generation, mature node, and back-end manufacturers. And then lastly, on June 26th, full applications could be submitted. Full application could be submitted for the current generation, mature node, and back-end manufacturers. So the door is open now for everyone for statements of interest. Leading edgers they can do pre-applications now, then wait for responses and get their full applications in, and then pre-apps can be submitted on May 1. We're doing this today because coming up in just not very long, all of the 4 categories of the first NOFO will be able to do pre-applications, and they've given all the information on how to do that. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick Lawhon and my colleague to talk in the details of what they disclosed recently about the pre-app process.
Great, thank you, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, we're doing this right now because pre-applications for facilities under that first notice of funding opportunity will begin to be accepted on May 1st, with the exception of leading edge, as Mike mentioned. And this pre-application is technically optional. However, it is highly recommended. It gives you the opportunity to get feedback from the Department of Commerce that's going to make your application much stronger. Now, the caveat to this is that if you are a leading edge manufacturer, pre-applications are not necessarily recommended, and that's because leading edge manufacturers are operating under a much tighter time frame. The sense we've gotten is that the department would prefer that leading edge manufacturers just get their full application in as quickly as possible. So the pre-applications, once they're received by the department, they're going to go through an initial screening. They're looking for completeness and to make sure that the project is actually eligible under this first NOFO. At this point, the department may return the pre-application to the applicant to correct any deficiencies at this kind of early stage. But for the full review of the pre-application, the Department of Commerce is going to prioritize pre-apps that have strong connections to the government's 6 priorities for the CHIPS Act. And we're going to talk about these priorities a little bit later on because they're very important for the pre-app and for the full application. But this strategy, it basically means that pre-apps that are received first are not necessarily going to be reviewed first or receive comments first. So Mike and I have mentioned that pre-apps will begin to be accepted for most facilities on May 1st, but this strategy of prioritizing review of the applications that clearly relate to the priorities means that you should really make sure that your pre-app is as strong as it can be prior to submitting, rather than rushing to get something submitted on May 1st. The department will then provide feedback on the pre-applications, and the applicant should take that information and incorporate it into their full application. And one note here, if you do decide to submit a pre-app, you will have to wait until you receive this feedback before you can submit that full application. Next slide, please. So now we'll dive a little bit into the components of the pre-app. So first off is the cover page, and this will just be input as a web form. So if you go to chips.gov, the application portal that's there, it will have these kind of questions that you will fill in individually. The system will also populate some fields based on your statement of interest. That said, these should all be reviewed very carefully for accuracy. And then you also have the opportunity to change any of these details because obviously things may have changed since you submitted. This cover page is very basic information, the name of the application, just kind of a name for the project or projects, the organization that is applying, and in this situation, you can also include your SAM account registration or your UEI number if you've already received that. You don't technically have to have done the SAM account registration at the pre-app stage, but you will need it for the full application. And as Mike mentioned, it's better to just go ahead and get that done because there are some rare cases where it can take several months to actually get that registration approved. You'll also have to provide a contact person at the applicant entity. And this needs to be someone who is actually authorized to make commitments on behalf of the applicant. And then you'll have to provide partnership information. If you are partnering with any other companies, the department's going to want to know that. So now we'll move on to the project plan, and we can do next slide. So the project plan is made up of a couple of subcomponents here. The biggest section of this is the narrative, and this will be uploaded as a separate document. And just to give you a sense of the links that they're looking for, the narrative combined with the workforce development plan, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that should together be no more than 20 pages. So, you have some space here to really dig into these questions. But the project plan narrative just needs to be a summary description of the project. So we say here, description of the project, if applicable, a consortium, a cluster profile. And so that's going to be how the project is going to attract associated and supplier, workforce, other related investments. And, you all are in a good position because for many of you, presumably, your cluster will kind of include the Phoenix area, and there's a lot of great stuff happening in the Phoenix area. You'll also need to do an estimated project timeline. This is a chance where you can create a narrative that actually addresses the 6 priorities that we're going to be talking about, and then justify the money that you're asking for and give a little bit more information about yourself. There will also then be kind of a web form component where you're giving a description of the project and answering specific questions about expected CapEx and estimated peak monthly unit production. Next slide, please. So you also have a Similar web form for facilities information. This is just to gather kind of information about how many facilities, what type of facilities, what is the technology that's going to be needed. And as I mentioned, the project plan narrative together with the workforce development plan will be about 20 pages is what you should be shooting for here. Next slide. So moving on to financial information, and this really is a big chunk of this pre-app. They're going to be kind of digging through the past and sort of projected financials of the applicant and of the project in order to decide whether to grant money or not. So each applicant is going to need to submit certain financial information about the project, as well as sources and uses of funds for the proposed project. Now, the Department of Commerce gave a presentation on April 13th, 2023, that really dug into just this question of kind of how to create the financials that they're looking for. And so we do highly recommend that you go look at that presentation. When you come back to these slides later on, you'll be able to click on that link that we embedded here to take you right to the slide deck from that presentation. And there should be a recording of that presentation up shortly. There's also PDF guidance that walks through the requirements for each step of the pre-app, including this financial information. So in terms of other components of the financial information, you can add sort of a financial information narrative. And this is a chance for you to kind of give some context to things that they're going to see in the financial statement and provide a summary of what they're going to see. They want an ownership structure. This is another document upload. And here you have to provide all legal and formal entity and organizational structure for the relevant entities. They want to know, what all the companies are in your kind of organization chart here. And then sources and uses of funds. So this is a complicated part of this. And there's a web form component as well as an Excel document upload. Now, they're looking for you to provide sort of the costs and sources of capital for the proposed project. Now, obviously, these aren't going to be final, but they're looking for you to kind of be making your best guess at this point. And then ideally, obviously, the costs and sources should be equal. Now, you can just create your own version as long as it kind of contains all of the information that they're requiring. That's okay. They have, however, provided an Excel template that we've linked to here that we highly suggest you go take a look at and try to use as you're creating this upload. Next slide, please. So company financials is another document upload. Now, in this first NOFO, they've asked for audited, consolidated financial statements at the fiscal year end for the past 3 years, as well as interim financial statements for the applicant and its ultimate corporate parent, as well as any key intermediate entities. Now, I'm going to take a moment just to say two things about the information that I'm kind of giving you here today about the pre-app. First of all, these requirements that we're walking through are all coming from that first notice of funding opportunity. And technically that only applies to semiconductor manufacturers right now. And we are expecting to get a second NOFO for semiconductor materials and equipment manufacturers sometime in late spring. And the requirements that are in there may be slightly different. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you're not expected to have every single item nailed down at this pre-app stage. There will be things they're asking for here that you do not necessarily know yet. And you can be honest about where you are in the process of figuring that out. The point is not necessarily to have every single item finalized. It's to get as much information as possible in front of the department so that they can give you meaningful feedback that will make your full application stronger and help with the later stages of the process. In these financials, you should also include any kind of key performance metrics, just kind of anything that gives context, margins, return on equity, anything like that. They're asking for summary financials for the project. Now, obviously, these are going to be projected, and they have provided an example that you can use so that you can see kind of what they're looking for. But really, it comes down to they're looking for a high-level summary of expected revenues, costs, cash flows, and then more importantly, like what is the evidence that you're using to create those assumptions? And then there also is a spot where you can kind of summarize what types of CHIPS incentives and what amounts you're requesting and why that is appropriate given the risks of your project. Next slide, please. So next component is the environmental questionnaire. Now, again, there is a template that you can use available at chips.gov. And this is going to allow the department to determine not necessarily that this is all the environmental information that they're going to need, but whether they think you will be able to eventually provide all the environmental information that they will kind of need in the full application and the diligence stages. So again, you're not expected to have complete information at this stage, but the more complete your environmental questionnaire is, the more it can help avoid delays later on in the process. Next slide. And finally, we have the workforce development plan. And so this is a narrative where you can describe how you are going to basically meet the department's workforce development priorities. So they're looking for applicants who can recruit, train, retain a very diverse and skilled workforce for the project. And they've laid out these kind of specific items that you should address in this workforce development plan. And but it's basically coming down to what is your plan for actually making this work and making this a sort of strong and ongoing workforce that can be relied upon. And with that, I will hand things back over to Mike to talk a little bit about the priorities.
Thank you, Patrick. Remember, the department priorities the CHIPS Act is broadly aimed at creating a robust semiconductor supply chain in the United States. To accomplish this, they've said now in 2 or 3 presentations, they will focus on 6 criteria when evaluating an application. As we mentioned before, the pre-application will be reviewed and to provide feedback based on your connection to these 6 priorities. We want to run through these again because you should use every opportunity in your submissions to them at the pre-app phase, even at the statement of information phase, if you can, to show that you're in line with these 6 priorities. These priorities are part of a holistic review. No single priority would make or break your application. However, the economic and national security objectives are the most important priority they've mentioned. Next slide. We will focus on commercial viability, financial strength, and technical feasibility readiness right now. And then Brett and Troy will discuss the other 3 priorities. Let's talk about commercial viability. The department is going to look at whether the projects based on their long-term viability and will consider, are you viable over the long term? Whether there's a demand for the output from your project, whether there's a presence of a strong customer base, whether the current and anticipated future supply of the output is there, and pricing models, and the presence of a strong supply for any needed inputs. To the extent that you're looking at where you're talking about the cluster and particularly the Phoenix area, GPEC has some analytics where they are very aware of what's going on in the entire community. If you're not, you need some support there, I would encourage you that GPEC is an asset to help you with that analysis. Next slide. Financial strength, as Patrick mentioned, is particularly important. They're going to look at whether your project can handle the financial stress, and they're going to look at some factors that include your current and historical financial situation, and or if you have a parent company behind you, et cetera. Is there financial strength to get this done? And then the reasonableness of your planned capital expenditures. Do you really need $200 million to do what you're projecting to do? And can you really connect the dots there? The likelihood that your project will be able to generate sufficient cash flows when you're done, and the timing of those cash flows with the milestones and the phasing that you're bringing in. The amount of private investment that has been committed or that you're in the process of lining up, and whether CHIPS funding is necessary for this project to happen at all. And also going to look at your credit worthiness of you and your parent company or any affiliates. If you're thinking about applying for the loan and loan guarantee piece. And I would remind all of you on this, they have talked about a 5 to 15% cap. There is a 5 to 15% cap on any grant monies that are going to be given out for any project. So if you have a $100 million project, that means 5 to 15 million cap on the actual grant. Then up to 35%, subtracting out what you get in a grant, would be available up to another cap of 35%, including loans and loan guarantees, direct loans or loans in which they provide the guarantee for it. Then on top of that, there is a 25% potential tax credit that could be applied for and obtained, and if you're eligible. But then on top of that, you're going to need private funding for the other portion of this project, and you need to show them that you've got that. Next slide. Technical feasibility and readiness. They're interested in knowing that you can actually complete this project. Have you got the wherewithal to get it done? Factors are going to include your experience, structure, your structure, and whether you've ever done any past projects of a similar scale. And as Patrick mentioned, you may not be able to present, not every applicant is going to be able to present this, but you need to show you made an effort to assemble the team to get it done. Key partners that you will have in the project. Whether you have the technological manufacturing processes to execute the project, including whether you have access to needed intellectual property. It will, and where does that intellectual property come from, and have you acquired those rights? And then the extent to which you have a construction plan for the project, phasing, and whether you've begun the process of securing contracts for construction, or you have team players waiting in the wings to help you. Or you should not wait to start talking to these people, your team players. At this point, when you file your pre-app, you probably want to disclose a good plan here. And the likelihood of any regulatory delays, permitting, environmental reviews that are going to slow you down. Next slide, please. Some final thoughts. These projects are going to require extensive cooperation with private and public entities to support you, and that should be, those discussions should be happening now, even if you are not covered by this first NOFO. Brett and Troy are going to talk about the Arizona Commerce Authority letter, but they're higher educational connections, and then also optional, but I mean, do you have some congressional people that are going to support you with letters? GPEC supporting a letter. You can't just call all of these folks and get it done. It takes time to get those letters to support you. So it's time to make your planning. If you've not, again, submitted a statement of interest, you should do that, because that'll give the department a sense of how much money they need to be holding back for future NOFOs. Although and you need to recall that once you've submitted that, you have to wait 21 days before submitting a pre-app or a full application. So get your statement of interest in first. And as we approach that date for the most of the semiconductor manufacturers being accepted under this first NOFO, keep in mind they're going to prioritize and review and provide comments that show clear and strong connections to the 6 priorities. It's not the first person to get theirs filed, so take time to show that your pre-app is strong and meets the 6 priorities, so that you can end up receiving feedback sooner and that yours is picked out of the pack to take a look at. Next slide, please. And these are some other links that you may want to consider: chips.gov, the Central Hub, their first NOFO in detail, the application portal online where you will present and do your full application there as well, and then frequently asked questions. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brett and Troy to talk about their portion.
Thank you very much, Mike and Patrick, for that very insightful presentation. And moving on, our next speakers are Brett Johnson and Troy Galan. Brett Johnson is a partner with Snell and Wilmer, where he represents businesses and individuals in government relations matters. His practice includes government regulatory compliance, export and import controls, government contracting, and political law. Troy Galan is an associate with Snell and Wilmer, where he represents publicly and privately held companies, as well as government agencies analyzing international trade and sanctions compliance activity, including risk assessments, due diligence, export licensing, import duties, and potential violations. With that, I'll hand it over to Brett and Troy. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean, and good afternoon, everybody. Next slide, please. We'll go straight to that. But I did want to comment real quick on some of Mike's last comments. For what we've experienced so far with the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Commerce, is on the statement of interest. If you have a good one, they are doing these post statement of interest meetings, kind of like a meet and greet, but they are providing some pretty good feedback. So I do, again, echo what Mike said and get your statement of interest in as quickly as possible. I also agree with what Mike said about the pre-application, spending some good time on it. I'm a little bit more concerned on the timing issue and waiting too long, especially on the first tranche. And the reason being is that we have seen some really outlandish, crazy ideas that aren't going to go anywhere, but those still need to be sifted through back in DC. And so in my opinion, you still want your application on the top of the pile so that you're getting into that first conversation with the Department of Commerce. Troy and I are going to be talking about some of the other priorities as well as the Commerce Authority. The first one is the economic and national security objectives. And next slide, please. So as part of the CHIPS Act, the statutory language provides two guardrails. These are statutorily required. An expansion guardrail, basically how is the industry going to be expanded here in the United States, and then the technology guardrail, and obviously the importance of the leading edge technology. We'll go through each of those guardrails in detail. On March 21st, the Department of Commerce released a notice of proposed rulemaking. When finalized, this will obviously govern the enforcement of the guardrails. In our experience, a lot of times the regulatory framework would put out there for proposed rulemaking. There's little change on the back end. However, one recommendation that we have been providing people is to use this as a marketing opportunity. So, for example, when the CHIPS Act was first coming out and first being discussed, there was so much emphasis on manufacturing, and I really do think it was part of the proposed rulemaking process and the commentary that the U.S. Department of Commerce got back that really brought in some of the R&D and some of the other activities, and not just so concentrated on manufacturing that basically spread over the entire industry and the supply chain, the importance of the supply chain. So review these rules, and if you have something to add, especially if it's going to get your name out there, you may want to consider it. And Troy's going to talk a little bit more about that process a little bit. And next slide, please. So why does this matter? You have to understand the rules and the regulations as you're getting into it. We have received an enormous amount of phone calls of people just wanting to throw in an application and see what sticks, and then worry about the consequences on the back end. And that doesn't really is not a good strategy. Number one, you're wasting the government's time, and you're failing to appreciate that none of these monies are free. There's always these strings that are attached to it. So the guardrails apply to the current NOFO and all other the CHIP Act funding opportunities for 10 years after the date of award. So if you receive $1 million in 2024 and you're done with that funding opportunity in 24, remember there's going to be these milestones that are going to be trickling that money through. You're not going to get the money all up front. You're going to then have a 10-year waiting period on the back end. And as we all know, especially in this industry, that's a cutting edge issue and really going to have an impact, quite honestly, on foreign competitors who are trying to be in this realm, primarily, obviously, for the government's concern, China. There is a clawback that has been discussed. that will result in the suspension of the award and then the return of any of those monies, plus interest. Now, that's not the only one you have to worry about is that as part of these guardrails and these milestones, as well as your application process, and agree what Mike was talking about ahead of time is that you might not know a lot of the information, but when you finally sign on the dotted line and you've accepted that award and you've promised the government to take certain action, that in itself is a statement to the government for the receipt of funds and has liability associated with it. So if you do not believe that you can perform as laid out, and especially in regard to the guardrails and quite honestly, the Chinese influence, being able to cut the cord from China, you might want to think twice before going for this money. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Troy to talk about some of the guardrails, and then I'll cover it at the end. Troy?
Perfect. Thank you, Brett. As Brett mentioned, I will be talking about these guardrails. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about the application about the expansion guardrail. In a bucket, basically what this does is it prohibits applicants, anybody that received award from the CHIPS Act, from expanding their manufacturing capacity in any countries of concern. Last time we did this webinar, we did not have any clarity on which country concerns they were going to list. We had an idea, and now we know for sure those countries are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. What's important to note about this provision on expanding a award recipient's ability to expand its capacity, its manufacturing capacity abroad, is that it will be applied very broadly. This will apply not only to the applicant itself, the award recipient, any entities that are above or beyond in the corporate chart, so the parent company and any subsidiaries as well. This is a proposed rule, as Brett mentioned, so this could ultimately be expanded to apply to more entities than what it is included now. For example, another part is included here, it's 50% of voting interest on an entity as well. And in addition of this being a regulatory rule, a statutory enforcement, this will be a written agreement that award recipients will ultimately have to sign. Next slide, please. So what are the specifics? Basically, any transaction that is worth $100,000 or more, of course, that applies to the equivalent currency in foreign countries, will be considered a significant transaction. What's also important to note is that this $100,000 need to be considered in the during the life of the award. That's 10 years. So spending $50,000 during the second year and then spending another $50,000 during the 7th or 8th year of the award will actually reach the cap that is prohibited here. As I mentioned, this will be applied in a very expansive way. So joint ventures also include, and you basically have to be aware of any merger acquisitions, any consolidations, any takeovers, any purchases from bankruptcy, and again, even items as lease terms. So any lease of equipment, any lease of space, or even leasing other companies, that is a common practice in some countries in Asia, that will be covered under this. A material expansion, basically any facility that its capacity is expanded by 5% or more during that 10-year period will be counted against this rule. Again, this is counted in the aggregate. So 2% during the first year and another 5% during the subsequent years will also reach this 5% cap and will be counted in the aggregate. The semiconductor manufacturing, this is a very this is a legal term, so manufacturing may mean something different than it means in the colloquial English for the rest of us. So this will include a bunch of activities, and the biggest ones are fabrication and packaging that would also be considered as manufacturing. When it comes to countries of concern, even though we now have some clarity on the specific countries, the proposed rule does indicate that this list may be expanded later. So for example, if the department determines that different countries being used to engage in activities that are counter to U.S. national security, that country will be added to the list. Next slide, please. There are a couple exceptions for this provision. The biggest one is for existing facilities and for existing equipment that is already in these foreign concerns. The proposed rule recognizes that a lot of manufacturers of semiconductors already have some infrastructure established in these countries, and it will permit that this infrastructure is upgraded. And what does it exactly mean? Basically, if there's a machine that there's a new version that came out, that new machine can be replaced, and that will not count against the $100,000 that I mentioned earlier. That said, the catch is going to be that they're going to be looking for correct export controls. So any machines, any technology, anything that is sent abroad that is covered under this exception will be looked into, and specifically for our leading edge applicants, that will be BIS, but also ITAR licenses through the Department of State. Again, for this exception to apply, it has to be regarding legacy semiconductors. So basically, all technology that we don't consider as important. That said, the proposed rule does understand that semiconductor technology is moving at a very fast pace, probably faster than it ever has in its history. So they do expect to update this list every couple of years, and specifically every 2 years. Next slide, please. There is a notification requirement that comes with this exception, and it applies to the rule as general as well. Basically, any transaction that may fall under the categories that we just discussed has to be notified to the Department of Commerce. And this is particularly relevant in the pre-application stage, because anything that is proposed or considered, anything that may be in the pipeline, has to be disclosed ahead of time during the pre-application process. And again, we do expect the final rule to require applicants to submit a subsequent notification if any of those proposed expansions do eventually become real once the award has been dispersed. As Rob mentioned earlier, there is an enforcement component here, and these notification requirements will have to be certified. That basically means they have to be signed under penalty of perjury by a high-level executive of the applicant, mainly the CEO or the president. Also notable is that they will require evidence to be submitted. So, for example, if you believe that a specific transaction, a specific expansion that you'll be engaging in qualifies for an exception, you do have to submit this notification, and then you have to submit evidence as to why that specific transaction or expansion qualifies under the exception. So in other words, they just won't take your word for it as it is. Next slide, please. The second guardrail involves technology. Next slide, please. And although it's similar and can often be related or even overlap with the economic, with the expansion guardrail due to its economic situation, the technology also will be very relevant. And what does it say? Basically, there's a provision on any joint research. There's no technology licensing with any entity of concern of certain products. What's important to note here, again, this also applies to the recipient and its affiliates, the parent company, any subsidiaries where 50% of the ownership is higher, or any of the voting interest reaches that 50% threshold as well. Something that I would imagine will be a question is, what about pre-existing agreements? Are those also covered under this restriction? As we know, several semiconductor manufacturers already have agreements, technology sharing agreements with some entities that will be prohibited, and we don't know that yet. The answer is we do expect that to come out with a final rule. For now, we're in the dark. Next slide, please. So specifically, what does this prevent? Basically, any joint research. So, and that includes 2 or any more parties. So even if there is a third party in between, that be it a university, a college, whether in the United States or abroad, that will be considered. This joint research does not have to be official. Even an informal understanding between 2 parties will be covered under this restriction. In terms of the technology licensing, that could also include things that may not be as clear from the beginning. So for example, any official technology licensing will be covered, but any know-hows as well. So you may have a license from BIS to share technical data with an entity, And even though that is allowed under that Department of Commerce license, you will be prohibited from continuing that export under this restriction if you were to be a CHIPS award recipient. Related to that, the entities that are covered, it's kind of a white list, but particularly it includes any BIS entity or any of the OFAC sanctioned entities, with particularly any Chinese military industrial complex companies. But again, this is a very expensive application. So any entity organized under the laws of the countries that I mentioned earlier, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, those will also be covered under this restriction. The question that we're looking for some clarity on is, what will the application be for entities that are covered under this category, but are also related to the main applicant? And the answer to that will probably be that they just don't want any US technology, any US advancements that are funded by CHIPS Act to really reach back into these countries of concern. And what technology and what products should be worried about? Anything that is controlled for national security or regional stability, that really is anything with an NS or RS designation under the Common Control list. Again, this is why it's important to have an updated export compliance program. A lot of the compliance that will come with the CHIPS Act will fall under the preview export controls that the Department of Commerce itself already manages. And again, for our leading technology applicants, anything that is military, anything that is quantum computing, that will raise some flags, and that should be looked at in a little more detail. Next slide, please. What's next? Right now, so as I mentioned, everything that we discussed is proposed, it's not final, and the Department of Commerce is seeking comments on this proposed rule. During several of the webinars, the Department of Commerce personnel have acknowledged that they realize they don't know all the information, they may need some assistance, and they also realize that semiconductor supply chains are extremely complex and cover several countries, including those countries of concern. They also want to know, as I mentioned, there is no guidance specifically on any agreements that already exist at this time. So if you have one of those agreements, definitely go ahead and submit a comment saying, this is how much it would cost me. These are the legal implications of me canceling or withdrawing from this agreement. And for those that may be concerned, those comments can be submitted anonymously. So even though they will be published with the final rule, especially if they were considered, the name of your entity will not be listed. And if you have a specific situation that you need to make the Department of Commerce aware of, you're able to submit that confidential information and business information, and it will not be disclosed to the public with the final rule. With that, I will pass it back to my colleague Brett to talk about the RE.
Perfect. Thank you, Troy. And just off of what Troy was just talking, that's the importance he mentioned about the comment period and understanding that time frame and how this is all going to impact your business operations. And I would be, if I were you, and it's basically you're a smaller type business, and some of these requirements are very arduous. Let's just be real about it. But that wasn't the purpose of the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act was meant to really develop the domestic industry. So the government needs to understand about the cost of decoupling and what that might be. Now, again, that will also lead into the amount you may be requesting. And then I'll mention at the end about confidential information, and Troy brought a good point there. If we go to next slide, please. Oh, before I apologize. So here are the broader impacts. Going off that, before we go to the Commerce Authority, you must provide a letter from the state or local government entity, basically showing that there's some other qualifying incentives that are basically some investment from the local officials. In Arizona, that's primarily the Commerce Authority. We'll talk about that process in a second, but it doesn't have to be. It just talks about governmental entities in general. So if you have an arrangement with the City of Phoenix or the City of Flagstaff or Yuma, or as mentioned by Mike previously, of getting GPEC and maybe some of these other quasi-governmental groups that basically have membership in both, and getting that type of letter of support or letter of incentive package is going to go a long way. So And also that when I mentioned the city of Phoenix, for example, a lot of the times when it's at the municipality level, it is these construction incentives, whether it's infrastructure around the facility or tax breaks or construction waiver of fees, whatever it might be. And then obviously also the workforce related incentives. If you're not familiar with the Arizona Commerce Authority, and let's go to the next slide as I transition, there are multiple opportunities at the Commerce Authority that talk about workforce development, job training, and the opportunities that are there. A lot of these are within the tax credit realm or in the jobs training too. So you'll have to really understand where you fit, and you obviously want to maximize as many pots as possible. For the ACA process, there is a questionnaire. There is traditionally, it's the same questionnaire. If you received incentives previously from the Commerce Authority or worked with them on any project, you'll be familiar with the questionnaire. The CHIPS Act folks who are over at the Commerce Authority are really trying to market this to a broad range of companies throughout the state of Arizona. And then it gets turned over to basically the regular incentive folks. And they're talking about at least a 1 week lead time. Keep that in mind. So as you don't want this to be the hiccup if there's more information that you have to provide. From our experience, it's actually taken companies quite a bit of time to prepare some of that documentation for ACA. And the thought process is, well, it's only going to take us a week, but it took a long time to actually collect everything. Similar data that you're going to need for the Department of Commerce anyway. Previously, we had understood that you had to be part of the task force, which means you're getting part of the mailers, you're taking part in their meetings. That has been clarified as not required, but still strongly recommended. Next slide, please. Here is basically a real snapshot as to what they're requiring, the requested information. Obviously, the site location is important, including an address is usually key so that they can do some of the economic incentives. The employment aspect of it, there's certain requirements for the benefits, the health benefits. It has to be over a certain amount that you're providing in regard to certain benefits. You want to make sure that you're in that realm. And then obviously the capital expenditures that are going to be spent on the new project. Now, just like the CHIPS Act, some of these are going to be estimates based off of your own internal data. So it's not necessarily important to get it exact, but definitely within a close range. Next slide, please. So that's the ACA. Some of the other municipalities might have their own, and you might want to work with both entities, the Commerce Authority as well as the local cities. Up here, GPEC is a great resource to be able to connect to the various municipalities. But here are some other best practices. As part of the whole workforce development, as well as the development of the R&D function of it, there is a requirement of interacting with higher education universities. So we have 3 great large universities here. We have a lot of other presence here. The reference is that it's local universities, so somewhere within the state. However, from what we've read is that you could expand that out to talk about opportunities with other universities elsewhere. We already talked about the municipality ones. Mike had mentioned before letters of support and commitment from key customer industries. That might be just the one step up in the supply chain, such as if you're in the semiconductor supply chain and you're going to an Intel or a TSMC, sure, a letter from them would be important. But to the extent that you're actually able to get to the secondary end user, which is, the Raytheons, the Northrop Grummans, the Boeings, anybody in the military complex, the aerospace, and they're writing letters for you as to whether or not your technology development or what you can do to help out those industries, I think is going to be key. Also, the biosciences and the health. Again, look to filling a niche that is not here already. So something that China does already well, whether it's some technology, foundries, whatever it might be, what you plan on bringing back, and ensure throughout the entire package that you're telling a good story, which goes to what Troy mentioned about the confidential information. You really have to do that right. There's very specific requirements. The worst thing you could do is put together a great package about leading edge technology, about what you want to do for the next 10 years. And then it's subject to a Freedom of Information Act page. It's not protected or proprietary, and it's now going overseas as to your entire business plan. So really think about that. Last thing I'll mention is the export controls, which Troy also discussed. That you can't have strawmen. Let me make sure we're clear on that. You can't say, well, my distributor out of, the distributor out of Orange County is getting it for me. That's not going to be good enough. So you're really going to need to understand where they're getting the product and making sure that you're not trying to skirt or get around the export control. One way of doing that is to make sure your flow downs inside your contracts are being done appropriately. And with that, I left 4 minutes for Sean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett and Troy, for packing in so much information into your presentation. And as we wrap up, I would like to ask, Mike, Patrick, Brett, Troy, if you have any final remarks for our audience, feel free to chime in.
Well, I would say just two real quick. I love Brett's comment there at the end of tell a good story, and really do not leave it for them to guess that you're doing something you're providing something that is critical or domesticating something to the U.S. that can currently only be obtained offshore, or that why you are so critical to this process. And then another just word of encouragement. If you're a construction company on this call and you say, I'm not going to complete an application, why am I even attending these calls? I want to tell you something. When $50 billion is being poured into this industry and you're around it, even if you're not going to do an application here, there will be a need for, this is going to be jobs for a lot of people to support this industry. And I just want to provide some encouragement.
Yeah, and I will jump on there real quick. I know we only have 1 minute left. I couldn't agree with Mike more. A lot of phone calls that we've received are basically support industries that are supply, and basically how can they make themselves look better to somebody who is going for this. And remember, in government contract, it's a standard practice. It's called a teaming arrangement. It's covered by the federal acquisition regulations. And the best team that you can put forward, especially if you have a university, other local providers, other large companies that are part of this team that's developing a project, that always goes a long way.
Well, thank you again to all the speakers and presenters today. I also want to point out that the Department of Commerce recently announced that over, I think, 200 companies submitted their statement of interest. So this is going to be very competitive. And again, we encourage all firms to engage with qualified professionals to assist you with the CHIPS Act funding opportunities and application. I'd also like to take a minute to point out that GPEC has a CHIPS Act web resource page. Our marketing and communications team, Logan and Serena, put together this curated site, and it just collects and collates all the information from the chips.gov website, and it is regularly updated. We will post our recorded webinar on this site as well, and we encourage you to go on to that site and subscribe to get the latest updates as we receive them and upload them into our webpage. In addition, I want to mention that the chips.gov website also posts their own Chips for America webinars as well. So there's a lot of resources for companies out there looking at considering an application for the CHIPS funding. And in addition, for companies that are actually planning to submit an application, GPEC can also provide an economic impact analysis that can help quantify the direct and indirect jobs impact of your project. So feel free to reach out to us if you have an interest in submitting an application and want an EIA report. So finally, thank you, Mike, Patrick, Brett, and Troy for sharing your insights on the CHIPS Act application. We appreciate the support from Spencer Fane and Snell and Wilmer. And we'd like to thank all our viewers for joining us today. We hope you found the discussions informative and valuable. This concludes our program. Thank you.